Welcome back to another journey through the quiet corridors of the past. Tonight, we're stepping into the tender, strange world of love, as it existed long before our modern notions of romance took shape. If you enjoy what we do here, feel free to give this video a gentle like and subscribe to join our growing community of nocturnal historians. And do let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all drifting through history together, scattered across the world, yet united in this moment of shared curiosity. Now settle in, dim the lights, perhaps light a candle if that brings you comfort. Tonight we'll explore the peculiar rituals, the sacred ceremonies, and the deeply human moments that shaped how our ancestors understood love, desire, and the bonds that tie us together. These are not the passionate tales of epic romance you might expect, but rather the quiet, sometimes bewildering customs that governed the hearts of people who lived and loved centuries before us. We'll begin in ancient Sumer, where love was literally sacred, witnessed by gods and governed by ritual. Then we'll travel to imperial China to meet a woman whose small feet were meant to secure her future, but whose heart had other plans. Medieval Europe will reveal its curious love pots, magical or fraudulent. We may never know. And finally, we'll sit with a Berber poetess as she navigates the complex dance between duty and desire. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to lose yourself in the gentle strangeness of love across the ages. Verse 1. Sacred union in ancient Sumer. The air in the temple courtyard is thick with frankincense and myrrh, the smoke rising in lazy spirals toward a star-scattered sky. It is the month of Nizanu, when the barley grows tall and the date palms heavy with fruit. And in the great ziggurat of Babylon, preparations have been underway for days. Tonight, two souls will enact the most sacred of unions, not merely for themselves, but for the very fertility of the land, the prosperity of the harvest, and the favor of the gods. Her name is Iltani, meaning, "My goddess has heard," and she moves with the measured grace of one who knows she carries the hopes of an entire community on her shoulders. The heavy gold ornaments at her throat catch the flickering light of oil lamps as she processes slowly through the temple's inner chambers. Each step is deliberate, ritualized, accompanied by the soft chanting of priestesses whose voices seem to merge with the very walls of this ancient place. The young man who waits for her, Shamash Belushur, has spent the day in purification rituals. His skin still carries the faint scent of the oils with which he was anointed cedar and sandalwood, precious substances that traveled countless miles to reach this moment. His hands, roughened by work in his family's grain storehouse, have been softened with sweet-smelling unguents. Tonight, he is not merely a merchant's son. Tonight, he represents Dumuzi, the shepherd god, come to unite with Inanna, goddess of love and fertility. But let us step back from this climactic moment and consider the days that led to this night. For in ancient Sumer, love, even sacred love, was never hurried. Iltani had known of her destiny since childhood. Born under favorable stars during the month dedicated to Inanna, she had been selected by the temple priests when she was barely 7 years old. This was not a tragedy, as we might imagine it today, but an honor that elevated her family's status and promised them prosperity. For 12 years, she had lived within the temple complex, learning the sacred songs, the ritual dances, the precise movements that would please the goddess. Her education was not limited to the sacred arts. She learned to read and write in the complex cuneiform script, mastering both Sumerian and the Akkadian that was becoming the language of trade and diplomacy. She studied mathematics, astronomy, and the healing properties of herbs. The temple priestesses were among the most educated women in the known world, their knowledge valued by kings and merchants alike. On quiet afternoons, when the heat of the day drove most people to shaded courtyards, Iltani would sit in the temple's garden, practicing her lyre, playing beneath the shade of pomegranate trees. The garden was a marvel. Carefully irrigated channels brought water from the distant Euphrates, allowing exotic plants to flourish in the dry earth. Roses from the mountains, jasmine from distant lands, and always the date palms that formed the economic backbone of the region. It was in this garden that she first glimpsed Shamash Baal-Ashur, 3 months before the sacred marriage ceremony. He had come with his father to deliver the temple's share of the grain harvest, and while the men conducted their business in the administrative chambers, he had wandered, perhaps drawn by the sound of her lyre. The moment is preserved in a tablet that still exists today, written in her own careful hand, for she, like all temple priestesses, kept detailed records of significant events. "I saw him standing by the fountain," she wrote, his head tilted as though listening to something beyond the music. "When our eyes met, I felt as though Inanna herself had touched my heart with her finger." But this was not the romantic meeting of our modern imagination. Shamash Baal-Ashur withdrew immediately, properly, as custom demanded. Any communication between them would be conducted through intermediaries, according to rituals that had been established centuries before their birth. Their personal feelings, while acknowledged, were secondary to the sacred purpose they would serve. The preparation for their union involved not just the couple, but the entire community. For weeks before the ceremony, the city's artisans worked to create the elaborate costumes, jewelry, and ritual objects that would be needed. Goldsmiths crafted delicate diadems set with lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. Weavers created fabrics so fine they seemed to shimmer like water in the lamplight. The temple's economic records, preserved on countless clay tablets, reveal the enormous cost and complexity of these preparations. Hundreds of sheep and cattle were designated for the feast that would follow the ceremony. Jars of wine and beer were set aside, their contents fermenting slowly in the temple's cool storerooms. Musicians were hired from as far away as the cedar forests of Lebanon, their exotic instruments adding to the otherworldly atmosphere of the event. But perhaps the most elaborate preparations were those involving Iltani herself. Each day for a month before the ceremony, she underwent ritual purifications. She bathed in water that had been blessed by the morning star, Inanna's celestial manifestation. Her hair was washed with a mixture of honey and aromatic oils, then arranged in increasingly complex styles as the ceremony approached. The other priestesses tended to every detail of her appearance, with the devotion usually reserved for preparing a statue of the goddess herself. Her fingernails were painted with henna in intricate patterns that told the story of Inanna's descent to the underworld and her triumphant return. Kohl outlined her eyes in the distinctive style that made them appear larger, more goddess-like. Her lips were stained with a mixture of ochre and beeswax that gave them the color of ripe pomegranates. Meanwhile, Shamash Baal-Ashur underwent his own transformation. The rituals for the male participant were less elaborate, but no less significant. He spent 7 days in the temple's outer courtyards, sleeping on reed mats and eating only specific foods, barley bread, dates, and goat's milk that were believed to enhance his spiritual purity. Each morning, he joined the temple's male attendants in exercises designed to strengthen both body and spirit. They practiced ritual wrestling, a sacred art that honored the god Gilgamesh. They learned the chants that would accompany the ceremony, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the ziggurat. On the day before the ceremony, both participants underwent a final purification that lasted from sunset to sunrise. They entered separate ritual baths pools, lined with precious stones and filled with water that had been exposed to the light of specific stars. The water was scented with myrrh and frankincense, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist somewhere between the earthly and the divine. As Eltani descended into the sacred pool, the other priestesses began a chant that had been old when Babylon was young. The words, in the ancient Sumerian tongue, told of Inanna's power over all growing things, her ability to make the earth fruitful and the animals multiply. The melody was hypnotic, repetitive, designed to induce a trance-like state in which the boundaries between human and divine began to blur. The water was neither warm nor cold, but seemed to match exactly the temperature of her skin. As she immersed herself completely, holding her breath in the sacred darkness beneath the surface, she experienced what she later described as a vision. She saw herself not as Iltani, daughter of a minor merchant, but as Inanna herself, goddess of 1,000 names, ruler of heaven and earth. When she emerged from the pool, the other priestesses were ready with robes that had been blessed by exposure to the smoke of burning cedar. The fabric was so fine, it seemed almost transparent, decorated with gold thread in patterns that mimicked the movement of stars across the night sky. As they dressed her, each piece of clothing was accompanied by specific prayers and blessings. Shamash Baal Usher's purification was equally elaborate, but followed different rituals. As he stood in the sacred pool, the male attendants poured libations of beer and wine into the water around him, offerings to the gods who governed male fertility and strength. The liquid created swirling patterns in the moonlight, and he was instructed to meditate on these patterns, seeing in them the cosmic forces that he would soon help to channel. His emergence from the pool was greeted with the sound of drums' deep, rhythmic beats that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. The attendants wrapped him in linen that had been woven from flax, grown in the temple's own fields, every thread a connection to the sacred earth that the ceremony was designed to bless. Now, as the actual ceremony begins, both participants move through their roles with the practiced grace of dancers who have rehearsed these steps countless times. Yet there is something deeply personal in their movements, a recognition that they are not merely performing a ritual, but participating in something that will transform them both. The ceremony itself takes place in the temple's innermost chamber, a room that few mortals ever see. The walls are covered with lapis lazuli, creating the impression of being surrounded by the night sky. Oil lamps burn in precise patterns, their flames dancing in the slight breeze that moves through hidden ventilation shafts. At the center of the room stands a bed that is itself a work of art. The frame is carved from precious wood imported from the distant forests of Anatolia, inlaid with gold and precious stones and patterns that tell the story of the god's own loves and passions. The mattress is stuffed with the finest down, covered with sheets woven from silk that traveled the long trade routes from the mysterious lands of the Far East. As Eltani and Shamash Baal Usher approach this sacred space, their movements are accompanied by music that seems to come from the very air around them. Lyres, flutes, and soft drums create a soundscape that is both earthly and ethereal. The melody is ancient, its origins lost in the mists of time, yet it speaks to something fundamental in the human heart. The final moments of preparation are almost unbearably tender. The attending priestesses remove Eltani's elaborate jewelry, piece by piece, each ornament kissed before being set aside. Her hair is unbound, falling in waves that catch the lamplight like spun gold. She is transformed from goddess back to woman, yet somehow more divine in her humanity than she had been in all her ceremonial glory. Shamash Baal Usher's final preparations are equally ritualized. The male attendants anoint him with oils that carry the scents of the earth cedar, sandalwood, and something else, something that speaks of rain on dry ground and the first green shoots of spring. His transformation is the reverse of hers, from man to God, taking on the divine essence that will make their union not merely personal but cosmic. And then, in the sacred silence that follows the final blessing, they are alone. What passes between them in these moments is recorded nowhere, preserved in no tablet or inscription. It belongs to them alone, and to the gods who witness all human love and longing. Yet we can imagine the tender uncertainty, the weight of sacred responsibility, the very human recognition that they are about to create something larger than themselves. Their union, when it comes, is both physical and spiritual, earthly and divine. It represents the marriage of all opposites, heaven and earth, male and female, human and divine, individual desire and cosmic necessity. In their joining, the Sumerians believed the very fertility of the land was renewed, the favor of the gods secured for another year. But this is not the breathless passion of modern romance. It is something quieter, deeper, more enduring. It is love as sacrament, desire as prayer, intimacy as cosmic responsibility. In their gentle movements, their whispered words, their careful attention to each other's pleasure and comfort, they enact a drama that has been old since the beginning of time. When morning comes, they will return to their separate lives. Shamash Bal Usher will go back to his family's business, his grain stores and trade routes. Iltani will resume her duties as priestess, teacher, and keeper of sacred knowledge. But they will carry with them always the memory of this night, when they served as vessels for forces larger than themselves. And the land, blessed by their union, will indeed prosper. The barley will grow tall and golden. The date palms will hang heavy with fruit, and the people will remember that love, in its highest form, is not merely personal but sacred, not merely human but divine. This is the world they inhabited, a world where love was ritual, where desire served the cosmos, where the most intimate human act was also the most public sacred duty. It is strange to us, perhaps, this blending of the personal and the divine. Yet there is something in it that speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of love itself, that it is never merely our own, never purely individual, but always connected to forces and purposes larger than our immediate understanding. In the gentle breathing of these two young people, in their careful attention to ritual and their tender care for each other, we see reflected something eternal about human love, its capacity to transform the ordinary into the sacred, the personal into the universal, the momentary into the eternal. Verse 2. The unbound feet of Lady Chun Mihua. The morning mist clings to the ornamental lake in the Forbidden City's outer gardens, and somewhere in the distance, a bell chimes the hour with gentle persistence. It is the autumn of 1582, during the reign of the Wanli Emperor, and in a mansion nestled among the hutongs of Beijing, a young woman sits by her window, contemplating an act of rebellion so quiet, so personal, that it will echo through her family for generations. Her name is Chun Mihua, literally, beautiful flower of the Chun family, and at 17, she possesses what her society considers a devastating flaw. Her feet are natural, unbound, a full 4 inches long. In a world where a woman's marriageability is measured in inverse proportion to the size of her feet, she is, by all conventional standards, unmarriageable. But let us step back from this moment of decision and walk with her through the garden paths of her childhood, understanding how she came to this crossroads between tradition and love, duty and desire. Mihua was born into the merchant class during a time when China's economy was flourishing. Her father, Qin Weiming, had built a considerable fortune trading in silk and porcelain, his caravans traveling the ancient routes that connected Beijing to the markets of Central Asia. The Qin family compound, while not grand by imperial standards, was comfortable and gracious, with courtyards that bloomed with peonies in spring and chrysanthemums in autumn. Her mother, Lady Wang, came from a family of minor officials, bringing with her the refined manners and classical education that would elevate the Chun family's social standing. It was Lady Wang who made the decision that would define her daughter's fate, though she could not have foreseen the consequences at the time. When Mihua was 4 years old, the age when most girls of their class underwent foot binding, she fell gravely ill with a fever that left her weak and fragile for months. The family physician, an elderly man who had served the imperial court before retiring to private practice, advised against the binding procedure. The child's constitution is delicate, he explained to Lady Wang, as they sat in the cool shadows of the medicine hall, surrounded by jars of herbs whose names whispered of distant mountains and secret valleys. The trauma of binding, the restricted circulation, the constant pain, these could prove fatal in her weakened state. Lady Wang, faced with choosing between her daughter's life and her social prospects, chose life. But the decision tormented her. Each night, she would kneel before the household shrine, burning incense and whispering prayers to Guanyin, the goddess of mercy, begging for guidance. The smoke would curl upward through the latticed windows, carrying her desperate hopes into the star-filled darkness above the city. As Mihua grew older, the consequences of this decision became increasingly apparent. While other girls her age learned to walk with the distinctive swaying gait that tiny bound feet required, she moved with natural grace, her steps firm and purposeful. While they practiced the delicate arts of embroidery and music, sitting for hours in positions that accommodated their painful feet, she roamed the family gardens, climbed the ornamental rocks, and developed a love of physical movement and was considered unseemly in a young lady of her station. Her education, however, was exemplary. Lady Wang, perhaps feeling that intellectual accomplishments might compensate for her daughter's physical inadequacies, engaged the finest tutors available. Mihua learned to read and write classical Chinese with elegant precision, her calligraphy flowing like water across silk paper. She studied the poetry of Lai Bai and Du Fu, memorizing verses that spoke of moonlight on rivers and the eternal longing of the human heart. Music became her particular passion. She learned to play the gupin, a seven-stringed zither whose subtle tones were said to reflect the harmony of heaven and earth. Her teacher, Master Liu, was an elderly scholar who had once served in the Imperial Music Bureau. He would arrive each morning as the dew still sparkled on the garden paths, carrying his instrument in a case of polished rosewood. Music, he would tell her as she practiced in the pavilion overlooking the ornamental pond, is the language of the soul. It speaks truths that words cannot express, carries emotions that the heart cannot otherwise release. His weathered hands would guide hers across the strings, showing her how to produce the subtle vibrations that could make listeners weep or smile without knowing why. Under his tutelage, Mihua developed not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of music's emotional power. She could play the melancholy pieces that spoke of autumn leaves and departed friends, the joyous compositions that celebrated the return of spring, and the complex works that told entire stories without words. Her performances became legendary within the narrow circle of Beijing's cultural elite, though few potential suitors would ever hear them. By the time she reached 16, her unmarried status had become a source of increasing anxiety for her parents. Lady Wang spent her days consulting matchmakers, temple fortune-tellers, and anyone else who might offer hope or guidance. The responses were uniformly discouraging. "The girl is accomplished," one matchmaker admitted, "but her feet. No respectable family would consider such a union." Chen Weiming, practical as always, suggested alternative arrangements. "Perhaps," he said to his wife one evening as they sat in their private study, surrounded by scrolls of poetry and account books, "we should consider the Taoist nunnery outside the city. The abbess is known for her learning, and Mihua would be well cared for. She could continue her studies, perhaps even teach." But Lady Wang recoiled from this suggestion. The life of a nun, however scholarly, seemed a betrayal of everything she had hoped for her daughter. "She is too full of life," she protested, "too passionate about the world. How can we ask her to renounce what she has never been allowed to experience?" It was during this period of family uncertainty that fate intervened in the form of a young scholar named Li Zhengming. He had come to Beijing from the southern province of Guangdong to take the imperial examinations, hoping to secure a position in the civil service. His family, though not wealthy, was respectable. His father was a village schoolmaster, his mother the daughter of a minor official. Li Zhengming was what the Chinese called Phoenix Man, someone of humble origins who might rise to great heights through education and merit. He was also, by the standards of his time, somewhat eccentric. He had traveled extensively throughout China, studying not just classical literature, but also regional customs, folk songs, and local dialects. His notebooks were filled with observations about the daily lives of ordinary people, the kind of details that most scholars considered beneath their notice. He first encountered Mihua at a poetry gathering hosted by her father. Such gatherings were common among Beijing's merchant class, an opportunity to display their cultural refinement while conducting business in a more relaxed atmosphere. The guests would recite classical verses, compose new poems on assigned themes, and engage in the kind of intellectual discourse that demonstrated their education and sophistication. Mihua was not supposed to attend these gatherings. Young unmarried women were expected to remain in the inner quarters of the house, perhaps listening from behind screens, but never participating directly. However, her father, proud of her accomplishments and perhaps hoping that her intellectual gifts might overcome her physical shortcomings, had begun allowing her to attend, seated discreetly in an alcove where she could observe but not be observed. Li Zhengming noticed her immediately, not for her appearance, but for her reactions to the poetry being recited. While other guests maintained the polite, composed expressions appropriate to such occasions, her face reflected genuine engagement with the words being spoken. When someone recited a particularly moving passage, he could see her lips moving silently, as if she were tasting the words herself. When a mediocre poem was praised beyond its merits, he caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested critical intelligence. During a break in the formal proceedings, while the other guests mingled and discussed business matters, Li Zhengming approached the alcove where Mihua sat. The conversation that followed was recorded in his diary, which survived the centuries and provides us with a first-hand account of their first meeting. "I hope you will forgive my boldness," he wrote that he said to her, "but I noticed your response to Master Zhou's poem about the autumn moon. You seemed to find it as overwritten as I did." Mihua's response, as he recorded it, was both witty and revealing. "I thought perhaps I was being too critical. After all, the moon has been compared to everything from jade to silver to tears so many times that there are few fresh images left. But Master Zhou seemed determined to use them all in a single poem." Their conversation continued for perhaps 10 minutes, ranging over poetry, music, and philosophy with a freedom that would have scandalized conventional society. Li Zhengming found himself captivated, not just by her intelligence, but by her directness, her willingness to express genuine opinions, rather than the carefully modulated responses that were expected from young women of her class. When the formal program resumed, he found it difficult to concentrate on the proceedings. His attention kept drifting to the alcove where she sat, noting the way she unconsciously swayed to the rhythm of particularly musical verses, the slight smile that played around her lips when someone made a clever observation. After the gathering ended, Li Zhengming made inquiries about the Chun family. What he learned might have discouraged a more conventional suitor, but it only increased his interest. The story of Mihua's unbound feet, her unmarried status, her reputation for unconventional behavior, all of this painted a picture of someone who, like himself, existed somewhat outside the rigid expectations of their society. He began to find excuses to visit the Chun household. Sometimes he came on business, discussing potential trade opportunities with Chun Weiming. Sometimes he came as a student, seeking to learn more about the family's collection of rare books and scrolls. Always, he hoped for glimpses of Mihua, brief conversations that left him more intrigued than before. For her part, Mihua was equally drawn to this unusual young man. His travels had given him a broader perspective than most of her father's associates, and his genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions was unlike anything she had experienced. Most men, when they spoke to her at all, treated her as a curiosity, the unmarriageable daughter with the unbound feet. Li Zhengming spoke to her as if she were a person worth knowing, worth understanding. Their courtship, if it can be called that, was conducted through poetry. Li Zhengming would compose verses and find ways to leave them where she might discover them, tucked into books he borrowed from her father's library, hidden among the music scores she used for practice, or simply placed on the garden pavilion where she often sat in the evenings. His poems were not the conventional love verses that filled the classical anthologies. Instead, They were personal, specific, capturing moments they had shared or thoughts she had expressed. One poem, written after a conversation about the nature of freedom, began, "A caged bird sings beautifully, but the wild bird soars. Which song reaches heaven first?" Mihiua's responses were equally subtle and personal. She would play certain pieces on her gukin when she knew he was visiting, selecting melodies that seemed to answer his written words with musical phrases. She would arrange flowers in the garden pavilion in combinations that carried meaning for those who understood the traditional symbolic language of Chinese floriculture. This delicate dance of attraction and communication continued for months, each participant acutely aware that they were moving toward a decision that would define their lives. Li Zhengming knew that marrying Mihua would mean accepting a bride who could never be presented in polite society, whose physical abnormality would be a constant reminder of his own unconventional choices. Mihua knew that accepting him would mean leaving her comfortable, if constrained, life for an uncertain future with a man who might one day regret his decision. The crisis came in the spring of 1583, when Li Zhengming received word that he had passed the imperial examinations with high honors. The achievement opened doors that had previously been closed to him, created opportunities for advancement that could transform his life. It also brought pressure from his family to make a suitable marriage, to ally himself with a family that could advance his career. His father's letter, which arrived with the official notification of his success, was both congratulatory and pointed. "Your achievement brings honor to our family name. Now you must choose a wife who will enhance rather than diminish that honor. The magistrate's daughter is available, and her family has indicated interest. Her feet are said to be no larger than lotus buds, and her dowry would establish you properly in the capital." Li Zhengming carried this letter to the garden pavilion, where he and Mihua had shared so many quiet conversations. It was evening, and the air was fragrant with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. She was there, as he had hoped she would be, playing a melody he had never heard before, something of her own composition. He realized something that seemed to capture the bittersweet nature of the moment. When she finished playing, he showed her the letter. She read it in silence, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. When she looked up, her eyes held a sadness that seemed to encompass not just their personal situation, but the entire weight of social expectation that pressed down on them both. "You must accept," she said quietly. "Your family is right. I would be a burden to your career, an embarrassment to your achievements. Love is not enough to overcome the world's judgment." But Li Zhengming had already made his decision. During the long weeks of uncertainty, he had come to understand that conventional success meant nothing without the possibility of genuine happiness. The magistrate's daughter, with her perfect lotus feet and substantial dowry, represented everything he was supposed to want. Mihua, with her unbound feet and unconventional mind, represented everything he actually did want. "I have a proposal," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "Come away with me to Guangdong. My family has a small estate there, far from the capital and its rigid expectations. We can be married quietly, live simply, and I can teach in the local school while continuing my studies. It won't be the brilliant career my examination success might have brought, but it will be ours." The choice he offered her was not an easy one. It meant abandoning her family, her comfortable life, and the possibility of eventually finding a more conventional match. It meant accepting the role of a scholar's wife in a provincial town, far from the cultural sophistication of Beijing. It meant betting everything on love, with no guarantee that love would be enough. But as she sat in the pavilion that had become their sanctuary, surrounded by the jasmine-scented air and the gentle sounds of the evening, Mihua realized that she had already made her choice months ago. The moment she had begun to respond to his poetry, to share her thoughts and dreams with him, she had chosen love over convention, authenticity over acceptance. "Yes," she said simply, and in that single word, She transformed herself from a family's burden into a woman willing to risk everything for the chance at genuine happiness. Their elopement was planned with the careful attention to detail that both their scholarly natures demanded. Li Zhengming arranged for a small house in Guangdong, near enough to his family's estate to ensure respectability, but far enough to maintain their privacy. He secured a position teaching at the local academy, work that would provide a modest income while allowing him to continue his research in writing. Mihua prepared for the journey by carefully selecting which of her possessions she could take with her. Her guqin, of course, and her favorite books of poetry. A few pieces of jewelry that had been her mother's, items that could be sold if necessary, and a small collection of flower seeds from the family garden, so that she could recreate something of home in her new life. The night before their departure, she sat in her room, writing a letter to her parents that would explain her decision and beg their forgiveness. The letter, preserved in the family archives, reveals both her love for them and her determination to follow her heart. Honored parents, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know that my actions bring shame to our family name, and this knowledge fills me with sorrow. But I have found someone who sees me not as a burden to be endured, but as a person to be cherished. I cannot let this chance for happiness pass, even if it means disappointing those I love most in the world. She slipped away before dawn, meeting Li Zhengming at a temple outside the city walls. They were married there in a simple ceremony witnessed only by the elderly priest and a few early morning worshippers. There were no elaborate costumes, no ritual exchanges of gifts, no family celebrations. Just two people promising to love and support each other, regardless of what the world might think. The journey south took them through landscapes that changed gradually from the austere beauty of northern China to the lush greenery of the subtropical south. As they traveled, Mihua began to understand the freedom that her unbound feet represented. While other women of her class would have had to be carried in sedan chairs, she could walk the mountain paths, explore the small villages where they stopped, and experience the world with a directness that had been impossible in Beijing. In Guangdong, they settled into a life that was simple but deeply satisfying. Li Zhengming's teaching provided enough income for basic needs, and Mihua supplemented this by giving music lessons to the daughters of local merchants. Her guqin playing, which had been merely an accomplishment in Beijing, became a source of both pleasure and practical value in their new life. Their house was small but beautiful, with a garden that Mihua designed and tended herself. She planted the seeds she had brought from Beijing, along with local varieties that created a unique landscape reflecting both her past and her present. The jasmine bloomed magnificently in the southern climate, its fragrance carrying her back to evening conversations in the pavilion, where she and Li Zhengming had fallen in love. The local community initially viewed them with some suspicion, the scholar who had given up a promising career in the capital, and his wife with the scandalously large feet. But their genuine affection for each other, their contributions to the community's cultural life, and their evident happiness gradually won acceptance and even admiration. Mihua's unbound feet, which had been such a source of shame in Beijing, became almost an asset in Guangdong. She could work in her garden, walk to the market, and participate in community activities with an energy and freedom that impressed even the most traditional neighbors. Her marriage, based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than social convenience, became a model that other young couples looked to for inspiration. Over the years, she bore Li Zhengming 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son. The daughters were raised with bound feet, as local custom demanded, but they were also given the kind of education that Mihua had received, preparing them for lives of intellectual engagement and personal fulfillment. The son, following his father's example, became a scholar and teacher, though he chose to remain in Guangdong rather than seek advancement in the imperial bureaucracy. As she aged, Mihua became something of a local legend. Her story, the merchant's daughter who chose love over status, who found happiness in defying convention was told and retold, becoming part of the oral tradition that connected the community to its own capacity for transformation and growth. In her final years, she would sit in her garden in the evenings, playing her guping as the jasmine released its fragrance into the warm air. Neighbors would pause to listen, drawn by melodies that seemed to capture something essential about the nature of love and choice, sacrifice and fulfillment. Her music had evolved over the decades, becoming more complex and subtle, reflecting a life lived fully and without regret. When she died at the age of 67, the entire community mourned. Her funeral was attended not just by family and friends, but by former students, neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by her story. Li Zhengming, despite his own grief, spoke at the ceremony about the gift she had given him, the courage to choose authenticity over conformity, love over convenience. "She showed me," he said, "that the most beautiful feet are those that carry us toward our true destiny, regardless of their size or shape. She walked her own path, and in doing so, she taught all of us that happiness comes not from meeting the world's expectations, but from being true to our own hearts." The small house where they had lived became a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by young couples who faced their own difficult choices between love and social expectation. The garden she had created continued to bloom, tended by her children and grandchildren, a living testament to the beauty that can grow from the soil of individual courage and determination. In the end, Chan Mihua's story became part of the larger narrative of human love, a reminder that the deepest happiness often requires the courage to defy convention, to choose authenticity over acceptance, to trust that genuine affection is stronger than social pressure. Her unbound feet, which had seemed like such a curse in the rigid world of Ming Dynasty Beijing, became symbols of freedom, self-determination, and the power of love to transform even the most challenging circumstances. This quiet revolution, played out in the private spaces of individual hearts and homes, reminds us that the most profound changes often happen not in grand gestures, but in the daily choices of ordinary people who refuse to accept that their dreams are impossible. In the gentle rustle of her robes as she walked freely through her garden, in the music that flowed from her fingers to heal and inspire, in the love that sustained her through decades of unconventional happiness, we hear the eternal song of the human heart, refusing to be silenced by the world's limitations. Verse 3. The curious case of medieval love pots in the shadowed corners of a medieval apothecary shop in the city of Reims, where the great cathedral's bells mark the hours with solemn regularity. An unusual transaction is taking place. The year is 1347, and Master Gaillon, the apothecary, is carefully wrapping a small earthenware vessel in soft wool cloth, his weathered hands moving with the precision of long practice. The pot itself is unremarkable brown clay, simply fired, no larger than a man's fist. But the woman who waits to receive it believes it contains the power to transform her life forever. Her name is Marguerite, and she is the daughter of a prosperous wool merchant. At 23, she is considered dangerously close to spinsterhood, her dowry substantial, but her manner perhaps too independent for the tastes of suitable husbands. The tradition of love magic stretches back to the earliest human civilizations, but in medieval Europe, it reached a particular sophistication that blended folk wisdom, proto-chemistry, and elaborate theatrical presentation. The practitioners of this art walked a dangerous line between accepted herbalism and forbidden sorcery, their knowledge passed down through generations of wise women, apothecaries, and village healers. Master Guillaume learned his trade from his grandmother, Dame Heloise, who had been renowned throughout the region for her knowledge of what she called matters of the heart. Her workshop, located in the cellar beneath the family's house, was filled with jars and bottles containing substances whose names seemed drawn from poetry rather than medicine. Tears of Venus, dust of longing, oil of faithful hearts. Rose petals had to be gathered at dawn on the feast day of St. Valentine, while the dew still clung to them, and before any human voice had disturbed the morning silence. Vervain, the herb of enchantment, was most potent when picked during the full moon by someone who had fasted for 3 days. The mandrake root, perhaps the most powerful and dangerous ingredient, required the most elaborate procurement ritual. According to the manuscripts that guided such practices, the root had to be harvested at midnight from beneath a gallows, using a silver knife that had never drawn blood. The harvester was required to plug their ears with wax to avoid hearing the root's supposed scream as it was pulled from the earth, a sound that was said to drive men mad. Dame Heloise's collection notebooks, written in the mixture of Latin and vernacular French common to medieval medical texts, reveal the complexity of these preparations. One recipe for what she called the filter of gentle persuasion required 13 different ingredients, each prepared according to specific instructions and combined in a precise sequence that took 7 days to complete. The herbs were dried in a room that received only northern light, ground to powder using a mortar made from meteoric stone, and sifted through silk that had been blessed by 7 different priests. The grinding had to be done while reciting specific incantations, the words spoken in rhythm with the motion of the pestle. As this powder grows fine, so shall his heart grow mine. As these herbs release their essence, so shall his love show its presence. Each ingredient was added while reciting prayers and incantations that blended Christian symbolism with older, pagan traditions. Saint Agnes, virgin and martyr, who chose divine love over earthly passion, grant that this earthly love may be pure and true. Ancient Venus, who rules the hearts of mortals, let your power flow through these humble herbs. The mixture of Christian and pagan elements was typical of medieval folk magic, creating a syncretic tradition that drew power from multiple spiritual sources. The completed filter was then poured into the specially prepared earthenware pot that would contain it until use. These pots were themselves part of the magic, created by a potter who specialized in vessels for magical purposes. The clay was mixed with powdered bones from animals that had died of old age rather than violence, symbolizing peaceful endings and gentle transformations. Sacred symbols were pressed into the clay before firing hearts, roses, intertwined rings, and sometimes more esoteric signs drawn from medieval grimoires. But did these elaborate preparations actually work? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous, filled with testimonials from satisfied customers, but lacking any objective verification. Dame Heloise's customer records, kept in coded script to protect both herself and her clients, tell stories of remarkable success interspersed with puzzling failures. Marguerite de Montclair, a baker's daughter, claimed that the love pot she purchased helped her win the heart of the young lord who had previously ignored her existence. Within a month of beginning the prescribed treatment, adding 3 drops of the filter to his wine each evening, he had declared his intention to marry her, despite their difference in social status. Their wedding was celebrated throughout the village as a triumph of true love over social convention. This explanation suggests that the most successful practitioners understood their craft not as supernatural compulsion, but as psychological enhancement. The love pots worked best when they gave people the confidence to express feelings that already existed, or when they created opportunities for natural attraction to develop. The ritual of preparation, the investment of time and money, the belief in the filter's power, all of these factors could indeed change the behavior of both the user and their intended target in ways that might facilitate genuine connection. Consider the case of Master Robert, a scholar at the cathedral school who had fallen hopelessly in love with the daughter of a prominent merchant. His natural shyness had prevented him from making his feelings known, and his scholarly pursuits had given him little experience in matters of courtship. When he purchased a love pot from Dame Heloise, he was really buying not just a magical potion, but a complete system of romantic strategy. The instructions for using the filter required him to find excuses to be in the young woman's presence, to engage her in conversation, to pay attention to her preferences and opinions. The drops of filter added to her wine were almost incidental to the real magic, the transformation of Robert himself from a tongue-tied admirer into an attentive suitor. The young woman, flattered by his sudden attention and impressed by his intelligence once he found the courage to display it, began to return his interest. Their eventual marriage was attributed to the power of the love pot, but a modern observer might recognize it as the result of increased confidence and improved social skills. Dame Heloise's most sophisticated clients seemed to understand this psychological dimension intuitively. Lady Eleanor de Vere, a widow seeking to remarry, commissioned not just a love pot, but an entire program of what she called romantic enhancement. This included not only the filter itself, but also detailed advice on fashion, conversation, and social strategy. Dame Heloise's notes for this consultation read like an early manual of dating advice. Wear colors that complement your complexion. Ask questions that show interest in his thoughts and opinions. Create opportunities for private conversation. Allow yourself to be seen as both desirable and attainable. This ambiguous status meant that practitioners like Dame Heloise could operate with relative safety as long as they were discreet and avoided the most obviously pagan elements of their craft. The emphasis on healing broken hearts and facilitating marriage rather than encouraging adultery or illicit passion helped legitimize their work in the eyes of community leaders who might otherwise have been hostile. By the Renaissance, the golden age of medieval love pots was coming to an end. Changing attitudes toward science and superstition, combined with the Protestant Reformation's hostility to anything resembling pagan practice, drove most practitioners underground or out of business entirely. The elaborate rituals and complex preparations gave way to simpler folk remedies and eventually to the entirely secular advice of etiquette manuals and courtship guides. Yet something essential about the love pot tradition survived this transformation. The fundamental insight that romantic success often depends more on confidence, attention, and strategic thinking than on natural charm or physical beauty continued to influence how people approached matters of the heart. The modern self-help industry, with its emphasis on personal transformation and positive thinking, bears a clear resemblance to the psychological techniques employed by the most successful medieval practitioners of love magic. As we consider the strange case of medieval love pots, we find ourselves confronting questions that remain relevant today. What is the relationship between belief and reality in matters of love? Can confidence and positive expectation create their own kind of magic? Are the rituals and preparations that surround romantic pursuits as important as the feelings they're supposed to generate? Perhaps Master Billon, as he handed that carefully wrapped pot to the anxious Marguerite, understood something that we might still learn from today. Love may not be literally magical, but the belief in love's possibility, the commitment to creating space for affection to grow, and a willingness to invest time and energy in romantic pursuits can indeed work transformations that seem miraculous to those who experience them. In the end, the medieval love pot may have been less about controlling others and more about empowering ourselves, giving people the tools, confidence, and systematic approach they needed to create the connections they desired. Whether we call it magic or psychology, the principle remains the same. Love often requires not just feeling but action, not just desire but strategy, not just hope but the courage to make that hope manifest in the world. Verse 4. The desert rose's arranged heart. The Sahara wind carries the scent of distant rain across the rocky plateaus of the Atlas Mountains. And in the shadow of an ancient fortress, a woman sits composing verses that will never be spoken aloud. Her name is Aisha en Tamert Aya of the land, and she is perhaps the finest poet in her tribe, though few beyond her immediate family will ever hear her words. Tonight, 3 days before her wedding to a man she has met only twice, she writes what she believes may be her final poem as an unmarried woman. The ink, made from charcoal and gum arabic, flows across the paper in the flowing script of Tifina, the ancient Berber alphabet that connects her to centuries of desert wisdom. Her words speak of two hearts, one that belongs to duty and one that belongs to dreams. Soon, she believes, only one will remain. But let us step back from this moment of impending transformation and walk with Aisha through the desert paths of her upbringing, understanding how a woman who has never chosen her own fate might yet find unexpected freedom within the constraints of tradition. Aisha was born in the year of the Great Drought, when the usual rains failed and the nomadic tribes of the anti-Atlas were forced to cluster around the few reliable wells. Her father, Amelil an Il Amelil of the Source, was a man of considerable influence. His wealth measured not only in camels and goats, but in his knowledge of water sources, trade routes, and the complex genealogies that determined alliances between tribes. Her mother, Tafukt, whose name meant son, came from a lineage of traditional healers and storytellers. It was from Tafukt that Aisha inherited her gift for language, her ability to weave words into patterns that could make listeners laugh or weep, remember or forget. In the long evenings when the desert wind made the tent walls flutter like living things, Tafukt would tell stories that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the world tales of jinn and saints, of love that transcended death, of women who found power in unexpected places. The Berber tradition honored poets, both male and female, but within carefully defined boundaries. Women's poetry was expected to focus on domestic themes, the joys and sorrows of family life, the celebration of births and marriages, the mourning of deaths. It was performed primarily for other women, in the private spaces where feminine wisdom was shared and preserved. Aisha showed unusual talent from an early age. By 12, she could improvise complex verses on any given theme, her words flowing with a rhythm that seemed to match the natural cadences of wind and water. Her reputation spread quietly through the network of women who attended births, weddings, and other gatherings where poetry was expected to provide both entertainment and emotional catharsis. Her formal education, such as it was, took place in the traditional manner. An elderly holy man, Sidi Ahmed, traveled between the scattered settlements, teaching children to read Arabic and memorize sections of the Quran. Aisha proved to be his most gifted student, mastering not only the religious texts, but developing a deep appreciation for the poetic language in which they were written. But it was her grandmother, Lala Fatima, who provided the most significant influence on her intellectual development. Lala Fatima was a repository of tribal history, genealogy, and traditional knowledge. She could recite the names and deeds of ancestors going back 20 generations, trace the complex relationships between different tribal sections, and explain the subtle meanings embedded in traditional songs and ceremonies. From Lala Fatima, Aisha learned that women had not always been as constrained as they were in her own time. In the old days, she was told, there had been women warriors who led raids and negotiated treaties, women traders who controlled vast commercial networks, women scholars who preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. The current restrictions on women's activities were relatively recent, influenced by contact with Arab culture and the gradual shift from nomadic to more settled lifestyles. This knowledge created in Ayus a complex relationship with her own circumstances. She understood and accepted the necessity of arranged marriage, the importance of family alliances, the practical realities that governed life in a harsh environment where survival often depended on cooperation between groups. Yet she also harbored dreams of a different kind of life, one in which her intellectual gifts might find fuller expression. Her poetry during this period reflected this internal tension. She wrote verses that celebrated traditional values while subtly questioning the limitations they imposed. The camel follows the path laid down by generations, yet sometimes raises her head to gaze at distant mountains. The date palm grows where it is planted, yet stretches its fronds toward whatever sun it can find. These lines, typical of her work during adolescence, managed to express longing and acceptance simultaneously. They satisfied the expectations of her audience while conveying deeper meanings to those capable of understanding them. The arrangement of her marriage followed patterns that had been established for centuries. When Aisha reached 18, her father began receiving inquiries from the fathers of eligible young men. The negotiations were complex, involving not just the immediate families, but the larger tribal networks of which they were part. Considerations included bloodlines, wealth, character, and the potential for creating beneficial alliances. The young man ultimately chosen was named Mohan Agamayas, Mohan son of Amayas, and he came from a tribe that controlled important salt mines in the deep Sahara. The alliance would give Aisha's family access to this valuable commodity, while providing Mohan's family with connections to the mountain trade routes that Amelil and Isle controlled. Mohan himself was, by all accounts, a decent young man. At 25, he had already proven himself as a trader and caravan leader. He was known for his honesty in business dealings, his generosity to those less fortunate, and his devotion to Islamic principles. He had never married, having been too busy establishing himself economically to consider taking a wife. The two meetings between Aisha and her intended husband took place under carefully supervised conditions. The first occurred during a large tribal gathering, where they were able to observe each other from a distance and exchange a few formal pleasantries under the watchful eyes of their respective families. The second meeting, considered quite progressive by local standards, allowed them to speak privately for nearly an hour, though still within sight of family members. These conversations revealed Mohan to be intelligent and thoughtful, if not particularly poetic in his expression. He spoke of his work with evident pride, describing the challenges of organizing caravans, negotiating with different tribal groups, and navigating the political complexities of trans-Saharan trade. He asked thoughtful questions about her interests and opinions, showing a respect for her intelligence that was not universal among men of their generation. Yet despite his evident good qualities, Aisha found herself struggling with a profound sense of loss. The life he offered comfortable, respectable, centered around the practical concerns of trade and family, seemed to leave little room for the dreams that had sustained her through the long desert nights of her youth. It was during this period of internal conflict that poetry became not just her art, but her salvation. Unable to express her feelings directly, she poured them into verses that explored the complex emotions of a woman caught between duty and desire, tradition and aspiration. One poem from this period, preserved in the collection of traditional Berber poetry compiled by French ethnographer Émile Laust, captures the essence of her struggle. Two paths diverge in the marketplace of the heart. One leads to the tent of contentment, where bread is always on the table and children play in the shade of acceptance. The other winds toward horizons unknown, where the sky meets earth in promises that may be mirages or may be oases. Who can say without making the journey? The wise woman chooses the certain path. The foolish woman follows her dreams. But what of the woman who sees both clearly and loves them equally? This poem, when recited at a women's gathering shortly before her wedding, provoked considerable discussion. Some listeners interpreted it as a celebration of wisdom over folly, praising Aisha for choosing duty over selfish desire. Others heard in it a more subversive message, a questioning of the very categories that divided wisdom from dreams. The wedding preparations consumed the better part of 2 months, involving not just the immediate families, but the entire tribal network. Aisha's trousseau was assembled with meticulous care carpets woven by her female relatives, jewelry crafted by the finest silversmiths, clothing embroidered with symbols that told the story of her lineage and expressed hopes for her future fertility and happiness. The most significant item in her trousseau was a small wooden chest containing her collection of written poems. This was unusual. Most women's poetry existed only in oral form, preserved in memory and passed down through performance. But Aisha's unusual literacy, combined with her family's prosperity, had allowed her to create a written record of her work. As she packed this chest, she experienced what she later described as a moment of revelation. These poems, she realized, were not just personal expressions, but part of a larger tradition of women's literature that deserved preservation and recognition. Her marriage, rather than ending her poetic career, might provide the stability and status necessary to continue and expand her work. The wedding itself was a magnificent affair that lasted 3 days and brought together representatives from dozens of tribal groups. The ceremonies blended Islamic religious observances with older Berber traditions, creating a rich tapestry of ritual and celebration. Ayesha played her expected role with grace and dignity, accepting the congratulations and advice of well-wishers while maintaining the demure demeanor appropriate to a new bride. But the most significant moment came not during the public ceremonies, but in a private conversation with her new mother-in-law, Lala Khadija. This elderly woman, who had herself been married through arrangement 60 years earlier, took Aisha aside on the morning after the wedding. "I know what you are feeling," she said quietly as they walked in the small garden behind the family compound. "I see it in your eyes, the fear that marriage will make you smaller, that duty will diminish your spirit. I felt the same fear when I was your age." She paused to pick a sprig of mint, crushing it between her fingers to release its fragrance. "But I learned something over the years that no one had told me before my wedding. A marriage is not a cage unless you make it one. It is a partnership that can expand your possibilities as much as it limits them, if you are wise enough to make it so." This conversation marked the beginning of what would become one of the most important relationships in Aisha's life. Lala Khadija, she discovered, had once been a poet herself, though she had never spoken publicly of this talent. She had used her position as the wife of a prominent trader to create informal networks of women poets, providing them with opportunities to share their work and develop their craft. "Your husband," Lala Khadija revealed, "chose you not despite your reputation as a poet, but because of it. He has seen too much of the world to believe that intelligent women are a threat to family stability. He believes, as I do, that poetry and practical wisdom can strengthen each other rather than compete." This revelation transformed Aisha's understanding of her situation. Rather than seeing marriage as the end of her artistic life, she began to envision it as a new chapter that might offer different opportunities for expression and influence. Her first months of marriage confirmed this more optimistic view. Mohan proved to be not just tolerant of her poetry, but genuinely interested in it. He would ask her to recite verses during their evening conversations, offering thoughtful comments and sometimes requesting poems on specific themes. His favorite pieces were those that captured the beauty and harshness of desert life, perhaps because they reminded him of the landscapes he traversed in his commercial travels. More importantly, her new status as a married woman gave her access to social spaces that had been closed to her as an unmarried girl. She could now attend gatherings of older women, participate in ceremonies marking important life transitions, and gradually assume the role of cultural keeper that was traditionally assigned to respected matrons. Within her first year of marriage, Aisha had begun to establish herself as a central figure in the informal network of women poets that Lala Khadija had nurtured for decades. She organized gatherings where women could share their work, provided informal instruction to younger poets, and began the work of collecting and preserving traditional verses that existed only in oral form. Her own poetry evolved during this period, moving beyond the personal themes of her youth to engage with broader social and spiritual questions. She wrote verses that celebrated the strength of women who found power within traditional roles, poems that explored the complex relationships between different generations of women, and pieces that reflected on the spiritual dimensions of daily life in a harsh but beautiful environment. One of her most acclaimed works from this period was a long narrative poem that told the story of a legendary female saint, Lala Aziza, who had lived in the region centuries earlier. The poem managed to celebrate both traditional feminine virtues and the possibility of women achieving spiritual authority, creating a complex portrait that satisfied orthodox religious sensibilities, while subtly expanding the boundaries of what was considered possible for women. The birth of her first child, a daughter named Tafakt after her own mother, brought another transformation in both her life and her poetry. The experience of motherhood provided new themes and perspectives, But it also intensified her awareness of the ways in which women's choices were constrained by social expectations. Her poems about motherhood were notably different from the conventional celebrations of fertility and family life that characterized most women's poetry on these themes. While she certainly expressed love for her child and joy in the experience of nurturing new life, she also wrote with remarkable honesty about the physical challenges of childbirth, the emotional complexity of motherhood, and the ways in which caring for children could both fulfill and limit a woman's aspirations. One particularly striking poem from this period begins, "The child sleeps in the curve of my arm, her breath warm against my breast. In her face, I see all the women who came before and all who will come after. She is the future, and I am the bridge. But what of the woman I was before I became the path for others to cross?" This kind of reflective complexity became increasingly characteristic of H's mature work. She had learned to find freedom not by rejecting her traditional roles, but by exploring them with unprecedented depth and honesty. Her reputation as a poet continued to grow, extending beyond her immediate tribal network to reach women in settlements and cities throughout the region. Traveling merchants would sometimes carry her verses to distant markets, where they would be memorized and adapted by local poets. In this way, her work became part of the larger tradition of North African women's literature, influencing and being influenced by poets she would never meet. The French colonial presence, which was expanding throughout North Africa during this period, brought new challenges and opportunities. French ethnographers and linguists interested in documenting traditional cultures began to seek out poets like Yosia. While she was initially suspicious of these foreign scholars, she gradually came to see them as potential allies in her efforts to preserve and promote women's literary traditions. Her collaboration with Émile Laust, mentioned earlier, resulted in the publication of the first collection of Berber women's poetry to appear in a European language. While the process of translation inevitably lost some of the linguistic subtlety of the original verses, it succeeded in introducing a wider audience to the sophistication and depth of this literary tradition. H's attitude toward this cross-cultural exchange was characteristically complex. She appreciated the recognition it brought to women's poetry and the possibility of preserving traditional works that might otherwise be lost. But she also worried about the ways in which foreign interpretation might distort or diminish the meanings embedded in the original cultural context.